Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Jeff Thomas, and I am going to share with you tonight, or this afternoon, forgive me, a little bit about methylation and weight concerns. For those of you that have been joining us every Tuesday afternoon, I want to thank you for participating in these conversations that we've been having on methylation. And for those of you that are joining us for the first time, I welcome you and thank you once again for being a part of this conversation this afternoon. We've been having weekly webinars on all sorts of aspects of methylation and its relationship to various forms of metabolism. Typically, these will happen every Tuesday from about 4 to 4:30 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. And for those of you that aren't able to participate at the time of the webinar, please be reminded of the fact that we will have these for recordings later on that you can listen to at your own leisure. But with that being said, I'll just give a brief description of myself. I'm one of the naturopathic physicians here at Health Coach 7. I do perform some of the genetic consultations that we have, as well as incorporate much of what I discuss through these webinars in my patient visits. And the idea is to really allow people to understand how genetic influences may be participating in their overall health and how we can use their genes as a means to help gauge where we should focus our efforts on, as well as maybe why things may not be happening the way that we would like them to. Ultimately, though, the goal is to allow people to achieve their goals and understand how genetics is playing a part in their overall journey. So as you can see, every Tuesday we've been going strong since July, going over various webinars as it relates to methylation. Well, the last one that we're going to have is going to be over POTS and EDS. That will be Dr. John Catanzaro who will be going over that particular webinar. And once again, just please be reminded of the fact that all of these are available at healthcoach7.com or on the Health Coach 7 Facebook page for your listening pleasure. So go back, review these, and if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please feel free to go ahead and email us. There'll be the email at the end of this webinar. So, what are we going to discuss today? As mentioned, we're going to talk a little bit about weight concerns and its relation to methylation. These are just a few of the bullet points that we're going to go over in greater detail throughout our presentation this afternoon. So the first bullet point, we're really going to go into the struggle with weight loss. Yes, it is a struggle. There are a lot of people out there who, despite their best efforts with dietary regimens and physical activity, aren't just able to achieve the results that they're striving for. What's going on with that? What are some of the obstacles to cure? What's going on in the body as it's going through the process of alterations in body composition, and what can we do to promote ideal body composition? Then we're going to go into some of the genes that are associated with body composition and how we at Health Coach 7 will use an individual's genetic report to interpret why they may be going through some of the struggles that they're going through as it relates to trying to adhere to their ideal body composition. And lastly, we'll go over some broad strokes to how we address treatment as it relates to healthy body composition. So why do so many people struggle with losing weight? Well, for many of you, you may or may not have heard, but basically it's been reduced down for a lot of people that, losing weight or maintaining a healthy body composition is as simple as calories in versus calories out. Basically, this school of thought believes that in order to lose weight, you must expend more energy than you consume, thereby creating a deficit that promotes weight loss. So we're going to go over a bit as to what that looks like specifically, but the idea is that we want to try to figure out, just at standing still, basically this is known as your basal metabolic rate. What is the baseline in which your body expends calories just to maintain normal body function? Once we've got that number, we would add in the additional expenditure as it relates to physical activity depending on the frequency, duration, and intensity. But let's just, to keep the math simple, say you don't exercise at all. So basically the only number that we would be working with is the amount of energy needed to promote day-to-day body function. Then we would take that number as it compares to the number of calories throughout your day. So let's just say, for example, a male in his 30s that weighs maybe 150 pounds, his basal metabolic rate may be 1,700 calories. So every day, his body is going to expend 1,700 calories simply by being at rest, just in order to maintain and preserve day-to-day function. Let's just say, for example, though, that daily his caloric intake is, say, 3,000 calories. Well, those additional calories, those additional 1,300 calories, if they're not going to be expended by the way of additional physical activity, It is thought that that additional caloric intake will essentially be stored as fat, thereby contributing to the overall composition of that individual. So what's important to note is that while some people have been fortunate enough for this particular approach to work for them, there are many others out there who, despite their best efforts through nutrition and exercise, still can't manage to reach that ideal body composition. So what is it exactly that metabolism means in the context of body weight? So from here going forward, when I'm referencing metabolism, basically what I'm referring to is this resting metabolic rate, the number of calories expended by the body at rest in order to preserve day-to-day functioning. So why does our body slow down its metabolic rate as we lose weight? This is something that you may or may not have known as well, but what happens to your body's metabolism as you begin to lose weight is that it begins to actually slow down. Well, why is that? To keep things simple, the more weight you lose, the less energy required calorically to sustain body function. So a heavier set person is going to require more energy to sustain versus a not so heavy individual. Comparatively, they would require less calories. So how does this work? What would be an example of that? And basically what I'm trying to illustrate to you is that body mass isn't the only determining factor for metabolism. So here's an example that I came across while preparing for this particular presentation. Let's say prior to your regimen that's going to be really focused on losing weight, before you start that, you go on a walk. And during this walk, at your current weight, you lose, or burn, I should say, 100 calories. Now let's say as you begin your weight loss regimen, over the course of that protocol, you lose 50 pounds. So let's just say you went from 200 pounds to 150 pounds. At 150 pounds, you then go back and complete that same walk that you did initially before you started the weight loss protocol. But in addition to that same walk, you add a 50-pound weighted vest. So in theory, you're right back at that weight that you were before you began the weight loss protocol. So in theory, if body mass was the only determining factor for metabolism, we should be able to go ahead and predict that back at your original weight, you would burn the same calories. So even though you were 150 pounds at the end of the protocol, because you put on that 50-pound weighted vest, that brought you back up to your pre-weight loss weight, thereby putting you back at that initial weight. So if you're back at that initial weight, you should, in theory, be losing the same amount of calories. Well, they did some studies on this, and actually what they found is that no, that's not the case. What they observed in those studies is that people who have lost weight burn fewer calories from exercise, even when they are wearing a weight vest that brought them back to their former pre-weight loss weight. So what do we do with this? What does this mean practically going forward? Basically, we're talking about how people with lower body weight after weight loss typically have a slower metabolism than someone who's always been heavier. And the reason for this is that your body becomes more efficient in expending energy. So you may have found that as you're going through your weight loss protocol, you begin to plateau, for example. You've reached a point where you're no longer losing weight at the rate at which you did. One of the reasons that may be is that it's not because you've fallen off the wagon, or it's not because you have been unwilling or lazy. It's simply a physiological response to the fact that your body has become more efficient. And so what we have to do is make additional tweaks to sort of stimulate weight loss. And so that's something that we definitely want to bring into consideration as to why sometimes some people are asking themselves, I've been sticking to the same program, it worked for me that first month. I was looking great, my clothes were fitting better, I felt amazing, and then suddenly after a few months, I just plateaued. Well, what's happening? And this is one of the reasons as to why. So let's go on to the next bullet point here. What is it that our endocrine system or circulating hormones have to do with weight loss? Specifically, one of the organs that I want to bring up for the purposes of our conversation this afternoon is the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland, for those of you that don't know, is situated right at about in the midline of the neck, right about where an Adam's apple is on a male. Generally speaking, that's where your thyroid gland is. The function of that gland overall is to influence body metabolism, so energy homeostasis is another one. So say, for example, I observe clinically many individuals who are coming in with a hypofunctioning thyroid gland. That means someone's trying to stimulate the function of the thyroid gland, that hormone, but somehow further downstream, it's not producing enough of the active hormone to maintain body homeostasis. One of the side effects or consequences of a low functioning thyroid gland is going to be the inability to lose weight, or another way of stating it is that they begin to actually pack on and hold on to the weight. So that's one of the organs that may or may not have been known as it relates to why sometimes, even if nutrition is where it should be, and even if physical activity is looking like it's in the right place, why you may not be losing the weight. So when you're sitting down with your doctor, I would certainly challenge them, if you haven't discussed it already, to look at your thyroid gland as one of the potential indicators of why your body composition is the way that it is. So what are some other factors that are going to affect body composition? We've talked to some extent about the slowing down of metabolism. And one of the reasons that this happens is that whenever you begin to restrict calories, the body believes that it's actually beginning to experience some degree of starvation. So consequently, it's going to adjust your metabolic rate depending on how much you consume. It's through these hormonal adaptations that our bodies seem to be fighting our efforts to shed the pounds. So that, in addition to becoming more efficient at expending calories, is why sometimes our metabolism can start to be a little bit tricky and really impede our efforts to reach that ideal weight that we're looking for. Now, as we get on to these subsequent bullet points, essentially what I'm about to cover is epigenetics. And so what we're trying to really illustrate here is that how epigenetics affects gene expression without actually changing the DNA sequence. We're looking at basically environmental exposures during a critical developmental period and how they can affect the profile of epigenetic influences, specifically as it relates to obesity. So let's start with your mother and how her influence can really impact a child's health. So one of the things that come to mind continuously is that during your mother's pregnancy, there can be the difference between the mom who is exercising repeatedly and consistently, and she's also using mindfulness-based approaches to eating, which means she's just conscious of the choices that she makes, and she's making healthy choices to promote the ideal health of not only her body, but the baby inside of her as well. They have found that in studies, women who exercise through pregnancy as well as utilize these mindfulness-based approaches to eating tend to have more positive outcomes as it relates to the child, as compared to those mothers who just were completely inactive and were not making very mindful approaches as it relates to eating, much more processed, much more fast food, and really weren't even mindful of the amount of weight that they gained. Typically, the healthy amount of weight for a pregnant woman can range anywhere from 25 to 35 pounds. For those that exceed that, there has been some correlation that it can predispose the child to things such as obesity. Also, what's important to note is that during the mother's pregnancy, moms can pass on obesity-related genes that can increase the susceptibility to not only body composition, but altered behaviors as well. So this is where we sit down with the patient and we look at their family history. Say, for example, if they have a long family history of obesity, then that's certainly going to play into our conversation, because what we're looking at here is the epigenetic influence, a genetic influence on the predisposition to obesity. So we're going to look at different ways that we can try to keep that at bay as well. And so moving on to the next bullet point, was the birth vaginal or was it a C-section? Studies have shown that C-sections have been associated with obesity later in life. Was the child breastfed or bottle fed? It's been demonstrated, or I should say observed, that breastfed babies have more positive outcomes later on in life. Now, honestly, it's worth pointing out that sometimes the inability to breastfeed is beyond the mother's control. But for those mothers who still have that choice, it's worth pointing out that if you can breastfeed, to certainly do so, because the benefits of breastfeeding far outweigh the benefits of not breastfeeding. Now, as the child gets older, one of the things to think about is, were there a lot of family cooked dinners at home, Or were the dinners at home more processed convenience foods? It's important that you introduce healthy food options early in life to your child and not rely so much on the processed convenient foods, because once again, these sort of dietary habits can contribute to overall body composition later on in life. Now, one of the other things, as we're moving on a little bit later on into the life progression of the individual, is was this person introduced to healthy lifestyle habits? Were they encouraged as a young child? Did they observe their parents being physically active and participating in all sorts of physical activity? Or did they observe a lot of sedentary habits? These can certainly affect body composition and habits later on in life. Also, when I sit down with my patients, one of the things we're going to want to look at as well is their medication list. Unfortunately, some of the side effects of certain medications can be weight gain. So if that's the case, we're certainly going to want to look at that as well. Addressing the constitution of the individual, really looking at, is this someone who has a predisposition to being a disciplined person as it relates to physical activity and nutrition, or do they tend to be much more sedentary or lazy? This is certainly going to be just as important as all the other bullet points and going to be a part of that conversation as well. Moving on to the last bullet point here on the screen, we want to look at the gut flora as well. I talked about this in my previous webinar, and essentially we're looking at the microbiome of the gut. The microbiome is consistent of bacteria, archaea, and viruses, and this microbiome actually can really influence the overall many different aspects of metabolism within the body. And so one of the functions of the gut flora is the ability to support how we cope or manage stress. So for those people who have not been able to effectively manage stress in their lives, this can impact the production of stress hormones within the gut, thereby leading to sleep issues. If we are observing that a person is having inadequate sleep or compromises in their sleep, that sleep can have a direct correlation, or that lack of sleep, I should say, can have a direct correlation to body composition. So as you can see, the conversation as it relates to maintaining a healthy body weight begins as far back as the lifestyle that your mother lived while she carried you inside of her, all the way to present day with medications you take with sleep habits, to as well as the overall microbiome within the gut. And so you can see it is a far-reaching conversation that has implications all across the spectrum of wellness. And so when I'm sitting down with my patients, it's very important that they understand that it's not just a quick fix. It's not just one thing that's affecting their overall body composition. There are many different aspects. Now, as it relates to the genetic report that we share with our Health Coach 7 clients, what are we looking at there? What are some of the genes that we focus on? So going to this next slide, pardon me, I'm getting ahead of myself. Essentially, I just wanted to give you a pictorial of epigenetics, what those influences are, and how that overall can affect DNA replication. So for those of you that wanted to geek out to that a little bit more, please consider this a resource. Going on to the next one, these are the genes that are associated with body composition that we have listed at Health Coach 7. Many of these are going to be in the different dynamics. They're not just under one dynamic. For those of you that don't know, excuse me, under the Health Coach 7 genetic report, we have 7 different dynamics. What we try to do is take roughly 600 genes and apply them through a functional medicine lens to allow us to really utilize them in the capacity of optimizing health and wellness. But more importantly, what I find is that through 7 different dynamics of interpreting genetic reports, we're able to really put it in a practical way that allows people to understand the direct connection between, say, for example, the genetic report and hormones, their genetic report and their circadian rhythms, their genetic report, or their genes, I should say, and inflammation, autoimmunity, body composition. So that's what I really appreciate about having 7 different dynamics on the Health Coach 7 report. Now with that, these are the genes from that report that we're going to look at as it relates to body composition. And so starting from the top, looking at BDNF, this is mainly associated with neurodegenerative diseases and mood disorders. And so what's important to take away from this is that when we see polymorphisms within this gene on a genetic report, I begin to speculate that this gene may be influencing central nervous system pathways, influencing this individual for the predisposition to overall obesity. That's how I interpret that. Going down to the next gene, FTO, fat mass and obesity, This gene is associated with increased body mass. And it's also shown to have an increased predisposition to childhood as well as adult obesity. So depending on the person that I'm talking to, if I see this one present, we're certainly going to be looking at risk factors for obesity. Going down to the next gene, MC4R, this is also associated with the genetic inheritance for obesity. So if someone's wanting to look at a young child and see what is their predisposition to obesity, a few of these genes are going to be the genes of focus. Going down to LEP, leptin, this particular gene plays a role in the regulation of body weight. It's a protein which acts through the leptin receptor and functions as a part of a signaling pathway that can inhibit food intake or regulate energy expenditure. Clinically speaking, when I see this pop up, I have some concerns or risk factors for diseases such as type 2 diabetes and insulin resistance and obesity as well. Leptin receptor, there's a strong similarity between the receptor as well as leptin. Going down to PPARG, this is associated with insulin resistance, diabetes, and hypertension. The next gene, the ADIPOQ, this is also associated with obesity and insulin sensitivity. Many of these genes are going to have similarities, but I just want to point them each out individually. The ADRB3 gene is also associated with obesity, insulin resistance, non-insulin dependent diabetes, as well as insulin sensitivity. Now this next gene, DIO1. This gene is involved in thyroid hormone conversion. If you can remember earlier on in this conversation, we brought up how the endocrine system, specifically within that system, the thyroid gland, can play a part in overall metabolism, thereby playing a part in overall body composition. When I see this particular gene present as, say, either homozygous positive or heterozygous, I begin to have concerns about the possibility of either congenital hypothyroidism as well as hypothyroidism. So once again, that is a low functioning thyroid. And so if the thyroid gland is hypofunctioning, that may be one of the reasons why we're observing some concerns with body composition. Looking at these remaining genes, all of these genes are similar in that they are related to their circadian cycle. And one of the things that I want to point out is the relationship between the circadian cycle as well as the microbiome. So it's been shown through studies that the microbiome, which is essentially that environment within the gut that I was talking about a little bit earlier, can have a direct connection to overall hormone production, which can have a direct connection to things such as mood disorders, sleep impairment, and those two in and of themselves can certainly compromise our ability to maintain a healthy body composition. So circadian rhythms, as it relates to the microbiome, are certainly going to be an aspect of the conversation that we have with an individual if they're looking at wanting to maintain or at least strive towards a healthy body composition. So with that being said, let's talk about overall, when we put this all together, how do we move forward? The first thing I like to comfort the patients or the clients that I talk to with is that I think it's important that they understand that what we're talking about is a very complex issue and that it's going to be more than just simply telling someone to eat less and exercising more. There was a quote that I found rather relevant as I was preparing for this, and it was by a Dr. Arya Sharma. And essentially she was saying that telling someone to eat less is like telling someone with depression to cheer up. And that just made so much sense to me. And I think especially as a naturopathic physician, it's really important to get to know the whole person and understand the many different aspects that may be influencing their overall body composition, really looking at the mind, the body, the mental emotional connection, as well as a means to really optimize their efforts. For those people who require more support than others, I simply do not look at these always the case as being lazy or unwilling. It just simply means that they have their work cut out for them. And so it's important that we really optimize aspects of their progression, such as developing a support system, a community, but really beginning with this education piece. I like to really encourage people to understand that despite their best efforts, it may not even be their fault. They just have a genetic susceptibility, in this case to say obesity. And so we're just wanting to do the best that we can to really influence the genetic expression of the susceptibility towards obesity and that it's not something they may or may not be doing. And I really find that by delivering that particular point, people are relieved to find out that it's not personal. It's not something that they aren't doing. It's just simply a result of genetics. So going down the list, generally speaking, the big one is going to be mindfulness-based eating practices. What does that mean? Well, I'm not a big fan of the word diet. I think diet implies a fad or a trend, something seasonal. When it comes to mindfulness-based eating practices, this is a lifestyle. This is something that we incorporate every time we have the decision as it relates to food and nutrition before us. And what we're doing is we're being conscious of the effects of what we're eating, and we're being aware as to whether or not this is going to be the appropriate choice for us and how it's going to affect or influence our overall health and well-being. If we're going to make, say, more convenient choices that incorporate more processed foods, more higher salt foods, more higher fat foods, then at least you understand the implications of that versus just not even thinking about it and just saying it's convenient, it's easy, and I'm just going to go for the quickest thing available. What I want people to understand is that it's important to just be educated in their decisions, and then ultimately the choice is theirs. Moving on down to physical activity, looking at something that a person can enjoy daily just to keep them moving. As we've already mentioned, the gut flora is certainly going to be an important aspect of our overall treatment. So looking at different ways to balance the gut flora, it could be first and foremost looking at the overall health of the gut. Are we dealing with a dysbiosis of sorts? Are we dealing with a leaky gut? Are we dealing with some sort of colitis or some sort of food allergy and or sensitivity? Are we dealing also with the potential for a mood disorder? Are we dealing with someone who has a lot of stress and or anxiety? Really being sensitive to the mind-gut connection. And so if we're dealing with someone who has a very stressful lifestyle, take a single mom taking care of a few different kids, or a mother balancing two different jobs, being really sensitive to how that may be affecting their overall relationship to food as well as their overall body composition. Is going down to the next bullet point, we've already talked to some extent about good sleep hygiene practices and incorporating that. We talked about a supportive community, and then going further down the line, once we've optimized what I consider to be the pillars of health or the foundation of health, we would take a higher intervention if need be to support things like methylation and metabolism by way of nutraceutical support. And as an addition to that, if we need to, look at some ways to really modulate appetite control. If I'm working with someone who just has a really hard time balancing out their appetite and just is ravenous and insatiable with their appetite, then we'll certainly want to try to find some ways to really keep that at bay, to really allow them to have a healthy body composition overall. So with that being said, this was a pretty brief and overall direct approach to just the beginning aspects of overall methylation as it relates to body composition and weight concerns. This conversation will be ongoing. There'll be future webinars to take a much closer look at the various aspects of body composition as it relates to different sorts of diets. Say, for example, the ketogenic diet, I get a lot of questions on. So in the future, I will be putting together a webinar on the ketogenic diet, as well as some of the other aspects of the microbiome within the gut and how that relates to body composition as well. But in the meantime, this is just simply something to whet your appetite, so to speak, and I hope that you'll be able to join us for future conversations. So with that being said, here's just a list of some really relevant research articles that I found to be awesome in my approach and my preparation for this particular webinar. And for those of you that have questions, because this particular webinar was pre-recorded, I want to guide you to this very next slide right here. I want to encourage you and invite you to email us here at Health Coach 7 with any questions that you may have, as well as the opportunity to work with you one-on-one. I look forward to the opportunity, and I hope to hear from you all soon. I want to thank you for your time this afternoon and wish each and every one of you well. Thank you so very much.